You can sit right up to the.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Good morning, everyone. It's February 14th, Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
And Irene,
One of us
you
wore
look-
red.
You look
I got a little
good.
red. I got a little
Okay,
red.
you
We're
did.
just
Okay,
got a
all
little-
right.
Yeah, you got a
All
little.
right, everybody's.
I didn't do well at all.
No.
Never even thought of it. I mean, I thought of Valentine's Day, but I was stressing, I guess. But anyways, great to see you all and hope you had a good weekend. We have Ryan Patch with us again this morning, was in last week. And he is a participant in the Climate Council. And and we talked about how ag was to play a role in all of that, and thought we should have Ryan back in to continue that discussion and see what they're proposing to do for ag for keeping carbon out of the air. So welcome, Ryan, and I think you know everyone, so we can fire right up and let you get started.
Excellent. Thank you, Chair Starr. For the record, Ryan Patch with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Really appreciate the opportunity to be back with you, kicking off the week. Last I was here, big setup about agriculture and the opportunity that agricultural soils can play in both building mitigation, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it in the soil, as well as the role ag soils can play in building resilience, both for growing food crops and for the watershed. I am going to take some time to walk through agriculture and how it is conceptualized within the Global Warming Solutions Act as it relates to the emission reduction requirements that are promulgated in the law, as well as the net zero targets that are also laid out, and attempt to do a bit of history and a comparison about similar environmental management effort that was undertaken, and how the two processes for the climate side still has some work to be done as far as the assessment and tracking of progress agriculture is making towards either meeting the emission reduction requirements or towards the net zero goals. And so some keywords here I like to keep in mind: emissions reduction. The emissions inventory tracks the gross emissions of XYZ, transportation fuels, heating, cows burping, et cetera. We'll get into the real details of that. So that's the emission side. The mitigation and net zero side focuses more on net accounting and the net balance, both that it is emitted and then what is sequestered, both through both the reduction of emissions as well as the sinks and ability for the soils and biomass to absorb additional carbon. So we'll be digging into those points of the bill. And I will now attempt to share my screen. Apologies for being live streamed. Got it. Share screen. Right. Screen. All right. Okay, so it's picking up in the middle of the PowerPoint. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right, the international body that gives direction for how national inventories are being conducted, the opportunities that exist for mitigation opportunities. One of the chapters is focused explicitly on this term I'm going to introduce. It's not my favorite acronym. I do like acronyms, but this one doesn't quite flow for me. So apologies in advance. But in the climate change assessment world, the new sectoral term that agriculture fits into, this is from 2006, is the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector. People ask, Ryan, what in the world is other land use? Here, within this sector, it's meant to mean human managed land, whether it's grasslands, wetlands, urban trees and green spaces, all the other areas that aren't developed and built infrastructure. And I'm going to belabor this huge block of text on the screen, and I apologize for maybe reading a bit too much, but I think it's really important to contextualize, try to bridge the gap between what I attempted to share last week, which is the opportunity and how farmers are already doing good, and how we can track and support and encourage farmers to do more. And so the IPCC says that the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector encompasses managed ecosystems and offers significant mitigation opportunities while delivering food, wood, and other renewable resources, as well as biodiversity conservation, provided the sector adapts to climate change. Right? It's interactive, it's not static. Agriculture is going to have to adapt to a changing climate. This section of this is the executive summary of the AFOLU sector in the recent released 2022 assessment report, the 6th assessment report that was put out by the IPCC. Land-based mitigation measures represent some of the most important options currently available. They can deliver carbon dioxide removal, CDRs, and substitute for fossil fuels, thereby enabling emissions reductions in other sectors. The rapid deployment of AFOLU measures is essential in all pathways, staying within the limits of the remaining budget for the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. Where carefully and appropriately implemented, AFOLU mitigation measures are uniquely positioned to deliver substantial co-benefits to help address many of the wider challenges associated with land management. If AFOLU measures are deployed badly, then when taken together with the increasing need to produce sufficient food, feed, fuel, and wood, they may exacerbate trade-offs with the conservation of habitats, adaptation, biodiversity, and other services. At the same time, the capacity of land to support these functions may be threatened by climate change itself. So very interactive, a huge portion of the world's surface is in the AFOLU sector, is privately owned or human managed. There's a lot of threats to agriculture and the AFOLU sector, but also opportunities. And so at the core of this next part of our talk is an attempt to connect the benefits of sequestration with the emissions inventory requirements that are promulgated in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So I apologize for, once again, trying to compare this to the state's water quality cleanup efforts, but I think
it's all hand in hand, isn't it?
yeah, as we discussed, the co-benefits for water has many climate co-benefits. What I'm going to be digging into here for the next couple of slides is a comparison of how, right, the 41% of all phosphorus loading is attributed to agriculture. How was that measured and modeled? And how does that set up the reduction targets for agriculture and other sectors? And then comparing that to the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and the emission reduction requirements that are established in the Global Warming Solutions Act to try to compare how those processes were assessed. And it points to a gap yet unfinished, but work is ongoing on the ag side for the GWSA inventory and implementation. So on the left-hand side of your screen, this is 20 years of tracking, right? How do we know we have phosphorus problems in the water? We have algae blooms, and we also track in the lake the amount of phosphorus that comes in. So we know at the mouth of all of these lake segments, you can see the trend lines here, whoop, they're all going up, and they're all above the water quality standard.
Now, and when you started developing this phosphorus issue in the water, how far back in time did the council go, or have you gone to determine where that phosphorus came from in the beginning, and or is it just always been here?
Great question. The TMDL for phosphorus for Lake Champlain Basin is based on long-term monitoring since the 1990s. However, there are considerations for in-lake phosphorus in certain bays, St. Albans and Missisquoi, acknowledging that there is a legacy phosphorus load that was delivered long before any of the current generation was alive. So the transformation of the Vermont landscape, the harvesting of trees for developing potash, as well as wide-scale sheep farming, a lot of erosion, a lot of historic phosphorus is in the bays of all of these water bodies. So that's there in a consideration, but the focus of the TMDL was the current loading that's happening going into the lake.
But no, no research back in the 50s, 1950s, late 40s, maybe early 50s, when the US government was sending super phosphate by the train car loads to all points in the Northeast to get more phosphorus into the soil. Do you go back to that point at all, or?
That's not likely accounted for in the long-term monitoring that's been ongoing, but the point I take from that is government intervention can affect individual managers of land, right? You give a lot of phosphorus, they're going to use it. If you support cover crop, people will use it, right? So it's what public investments are made to support environmental goals. The point here for the greenhouse gas emissions is that they're going up and they're measured at a global scale, right? We know the concentrations are going up, and this is from the IPCC on the right, looking at the relative contribution of the different areas. So just like we know phosphorus levels rising in the lake, globally we know CO2 levels and emissions are increasing. This is apportioned into loading based on models. We know from the Lake Champlain Basin for the TMDL for phosphorus for Lake Champlain Basin, based on a lot of land use imagery, but it gives us the base loading, right? We know agriculture from the current greenhouse gas emission inventory is 16% of Vermont's total emissions, just like it was 41% of phosphorus. The EPA set out reduction targets for water, and I've highlighted the agricultural reductions for each lake segment. And on the right, we have the emissions reductions that were established by the General Assembly in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so comparing how we know that levels are going up, phosphorus and CO2, where does that loading come from? For the Lake Champlain Basin TMDL for phosphorus, we have this very geospatially explicit land cover data set and assumptions that are used based on the Ag Census and Forest Cover Index and a whole bunch of other considerations to come up with relative shares of the land base, how much agriculture is using of land in the watershed, what managements are being applied, a load that's delivered at the edge of the field and a load that's delivered to the water, in an effort to really come up with a rather granular and process-based model, which can give us a pretty specific degree of understanding about where phosphorus loading is coming from in the watersheds. And we'll get into more details with the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. The state utilizes the EPA state inventory tool, which is a downscaled national inventory. It's much more coarse. It's not process-based. It's mainly based on, the number of cows, as an example, the amount of milk produced in the state, the amount of alfalfa grown, the amount of fertilizer purchased and used by agriculture, right? Those are the inputs that go into a spreadsheet-based model, which output relative shares of methane and nitrous oxide emissions in that.
What are the dark red areas in that map on the left?
Developed lands.
So I assume the biggest one is Burling.
You got it.
Okay.
Yep, and you see the
Plattsburgh.
89 corridor down to Montpelier, Barrie area. Yeah, across the river. So this is the whole basin.
Yeah.
Not just Vermont, of course. And then kind of the accounting, right? The reasonable assurances. How do we, the EPA took the total load, apportioned it up into the watershed, ran scenarios about can agriculture meet these reduction targets and how are they going to do it? In most cases, right, RAPs were generally assumed to or modeled to meet the reductions. There are some special watersheds where they're not, and so farms are going to have to do more. But that was all modeled and accepted before the TMDL was signed and approved. No such real accounting about these emission reduction targets and how is agriculture going to get there on my research was conducted prior to the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so this question of how are emissions tabulated, how is agriculture going to get there, how are we going to track it, is a lot of the work that the Climate Council and the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee specifically dug into, trying to understand what are the most effective and cost-effective strategies for agriculture. Can they be counted in the emissions inventory? And if not, why not? And can we count them? And so that's basically the narrative of the next part of this talk, is trying to get into some of the specifics, starting from the big headline, right? There used to be greenhouse gas reduction goals. The Global Warming Solutions Act made them requirements. And it established a few different timelines, 26% reduction from the 2005 standard by 2025, 40% from the 1990 standard by 2030, and 80% from the 1990 standard by 2050. So some very aggressive, but the first two, the 26 and the 40, are in line with some other states and commitments that are made nationally. So goals to requirements. This slide's a mess. Two things to where did this greenhouse gas goals come from? Right, it was on the books. GWSA took that, made it requirements. You have to meet these requirements, or there's a cause of action against ANR for the state's failure to meet those emission reduction requirements. It was passed what best I can find, Act 168 of 2006, that was passed in 5/5 of 2006. Established those greenhouse gas reduction goals. A very important, and we'll conclude with this thing highlighted in green, which is to say, less than a month after that law was passed, the IPCC put out new standards and guides for how agriculture emissions are to be inventoried for a national inventory. And so previously, and we'll get into this, ag emissions, and then the land on which those emissions are farmed are counted separately in the pre-July 1, 2006 paradigm. It was then put together in 2006, and it remains so even in the latest AR6 that was just published in 2022. I've also just, there were amendments that were made in Act 209 of 2008, and then the GWSA was passed in 2020. And of course, there's been a whole bunch of developments, the Paris Accord and further greenhouse gas emission inventory refinements, the state of Vermont joining the US Climate Alliance, and a lot of drivers leading us to the GWSA. So in the GWSA, and this remains unchanged, right, those emission reduction targets as measured in inventory pursuant to section 582 of this title. So title 10, conservation development, generally ANR's title, has section 582, the greenhouse gas inventories in it. Back in 2006 directed, and it remains relatively unchanged, but directs them to conduct an emissions inventory. And since they started conducting the inventory, the state of Vermont has used the Environmental Protection Agency's state inventory tool. And it's an interactive spreadsheet model that takes the national inventory and downscales it to a state-by-state basis, and you're able to input state-specific data. In the case of agriculture, number of cows, milk production, you can adjust for the number that are on pasture, the number that are in barns. So you can adjust a whole bunch of specific parameters within the spreadsheet. But at the end of the day, it is still just a spreadsheet, and it is a gross inventory, meaning it's just looking at the emissions from the different sectors. We're back to maybe where I should have started. This is the picture of the latest greenhouse gas emission inventory that's put out by ANR, and agriculture is tagged with 16% of the contribution. To put out there just this data point, I'll return to it towards the end. This is from Dr. Ellie Kasiba. She was at FPR. She's now at UVM Extension. This is looking at those emissions inventory. So if you take the sum of the emissions that are counted in the inventory from this pie, and you put them on this graph, this chart, you'll see the estimated total emissions are here. When you include the net sequestration by forest and municipal trees, include emissions from land use change, and then from the burning of the harvest or the use of the harvested wood products, right? There is a net reduction in emissions, right? The forest sector took in the forest that we have in Vermont, the 73% of the land base took in about 42% of the state's annual emissions.
And does that increase each year with the growing? You know, trees will grow constantly. And I know we've had forests and parks and tell us how much a tree will grow a year. So our forests, is their growth included each year? Because it's all we hear about is we're losing our forests. Everybody's cutting all the trees. But you never hear anybody say, well, our forest grew by 5% last year in normal growth. And to offset some of the harvesting.
The Vermont Climate Council published a carbon budget, which is a attempt to get at this kind of net analysis of when we look at our emissions and then we look at the opportunities for sinks, how are we doing and how do they change over time? The carbon budget was run once and can be run again. I'm not the subject matter expert to speak to. I can say the importance of ensuring that our carbon stocks remain carbon stocks is important, whether it's agriculture or forestry. I do know in the use value appraisal program, enrollment of forest land seems to be up, but as far as the total land cover, I don't, that's not my area of expertise. So I don't know what I hear that we are losing acres of forest land, the maturation of trees versus the loss. I don't know what the net balance is within the forest sector. So I got to apologize and say I can't answer that question other than to say, right, we have a substantial carbon sink resource in Vermont that, based on this 2018 snapshot, would take in about 42% of all of those emissions. And so I think, as we get into looking at the emissions that are tabulated within the greenhouse gas emission inventory, within the state inventory tool, right, this is consistent with that pre-2006 framework. We have emissions tabulated on a gross basis, which includes those from agriculture with our methane and nitrous oxide emissions from cows, the storage of manure, the spreading of manure, and the use of fertilizers that are also tabulated next to sectors that are more transportation and fuel use based. That is obviously the largest share of transportation. Heating is another important sector, as well as electricity use. But the point being, as we talked about last week, the opportunity in the agriculture sector, including AFOLU, is not just emissions reduction. When we talk about emissions reduction, when we think about the transportation sector, we think about electrification, right? We think about taking an internal combustion engine and making it electric, right? That negates those emissions from the burning of that fuel. What do we do in the agricultural sector? And I'll get to the point of this, which is what we're counting, what is being counted in the SIT tool, right? But just to put up on the screen here, this is from the IPCC. Agriculture can prevent emissions, it can reduce emissions, it can sequester carbon, and you can use products to substitute for more fossil fuel intensive products, right? So there's a lot of opportunities in the ag sector beyond just looking at the emissions and how to reduce them. So, okay, digging into that 16%, I appreciate you bearing with me. As I said, the pre-2006 framework is still used in the EPA SIT tool, and it's looking at emissions from agriculture. What's included in this is enteric fermentation, manure management, which means the storage of manure, and then the nitrous oxide emissions from soils, which includes some alfalfa, but is predominantly the spreading of manure on fields. So it's our ruminant animals, mainly our cows, and how are we managing their manure? What's not included in this inventory, because it's a gross inventory, is we're not looking at the soil carbon exchange, the opportunity for soils to take in more carbon than is emitted on an annual basis.
Is that because that hasn't been updated since '06?
That's the punchline. EPA, I have a slide on it. EPA acknowledges that this was updated in 2006, that it went from being agricultural emissions and the land use change in forestry, another terrible acronym, acknowledges that they're put together. The EPA SIT tool still has those sectors inventoried separately. They are reported together on a national scale, but how Vermont has applied it is looking at these 4 categories of emissions from agriculture. When we say the emissions from agriculture is 16%, we're looking at these 4 categories. And we're not looking at the management of these categories. That's what will be established later. It's not, right, it is a cow emits this amount, spreading this much manure, stored in this way. It is a workbook that looks up the number of cows, the amount of milk produced, and then spits out the emissions. And so management, right, when we talk about managing for soil health or managing for efficient ruminant digestion, right, there are ways to affect emissions from manure spreading and storage. But this is what's being looked at within the emission.
The manure and the milk issue. I think we've been told in the past that why they use those 2 items is because of the commercial feed that we purchase from wherever that comes in here comes with phosphorus in those ingredients. And of course, the more milk a cow gives, the more feed you have to give them. And also, the more structural built the cow is, the more manure and feed you give them, the more manure they're going to produce. But what we've been told in the last few years is that feed companies have cut down tremendously on the amount of phosphorus that's going into the commercial feed. And my only question is that accurate? And are we checking feed, commercial feed today for phosphorus content to reduce the input into the animal? Have you guys at a council talked about any of that?
So the input of cow numbers and milk produce is a good metric, right? You have high producing cows, you're gonna have a lot of milk, you're gonna have a lot more manure, right? So that tracks, that makes sense. On the phosphorus side, right, how does feed affect emissions? That is an ongoing area of research. There's certain technologies or feed additives that are being studied that can affect ruminant digestion and the amount of methane that comes out. When it comes to phosphorus, yes, that's definitely been an area of study and talking point for a while. When it comes to whole farm nutrient mass balance, yes, phosphorus inputs and exports in the milk and the meat, the imports in the grain, all important to consider. when it comes to a nutrient management plan, whether it's a high phosphorus feed or a low phosphorus feed, that's going to be represented in the manure test, and manure is going to be applied and managed based on that test. And so regardless if it's high or low, it'll be seen and reflected in the volume of the manure stored and the manure test. And so it is captured. If they have a lower phosphorus feed, they probably have more capacity, because if you have a lower phosphorus concentration manure, you can apply more in an N-based limited system. So the question about feed management absolutely did come up in the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. It is a recommendation. It is an area that Vermont is looking to do more research, but is in the real beginning stages of trialing feed management for climate benefit in the state. So it's a recommendation and something that needs some more research and support.
But if you develop rules and regulations based on insufficient evidence, because you just said that it needs more study, but if we're developing rules and regs to move forward off faulty data, how are we supposed to get that right?
One saying I've heard that makes sense to me in this case and applied specifically to climate action, climate mitigation, is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We know directionally that these soil health practices are good for water, good for climate. We know how much we have accepted phosphorus reduction efficiencies from EPA and DEC, so we know how much the reductions are for phosphorus. We'll work out what the benefit is for climate on the back end. Let's just keep doing these practices. We don't want to recommend practices that may have unintended consequence. And so being cautious about more research in the feed management space is where we are at. That being said, the recommendations for other climate action on ag is definitely let's move forward. When we get the accounting framework set up, we'll count all those benefits, but let's not pause to make a recommendation. We know cover crop, as an example, is good for a whole host of things. So let's do it.
Irene?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did I hear you say the data is from 2006? And if so, how many more years are we going to wait before this gets measured again?
Sorry, the charge for Vermont to start tracking emissions was 2006. Since whenever the first one was published, I don't know. My understanding is this ANR has been using the state inventory tool from EPA, which is an appropriate state level assessment. The data, the most recent data is from 2017 for agriculture because it's based off of the ag census. And so this 2022 census last year will be published in 23. And so those figures will be used moving forward for annual numbers and other inputs like that.
Thank you.
So this is how emissions have changed over time for agriculture. Nothing too drastic, definitely some changes. Main mitigation options. Okay, so if we're just looking at, ignore this on the right because those aren't tracked in the emissions inventory. We're just looking at the enteric fermentation and manure storage, right? Some example mitigation strategies, dietary adjustments, improved genetics, improved reproductive performance, right? If you can get more milk per cow for the same emissions, that's a more efficient production of calories of food. Within the manure storage space, though different storages have different emission factors. What can happen is, and as you see here on the photo on the bottom, digesters, right? You can cover and collect biogas, and you can either flare it, just converting the methane to CO2. And since the methane is such a high global warming potential, by destroying the methane and turning it to CO2, that is counted as emission reduction in methane. And that is currently the emissions reductions that agriculture has in the emissions inventory. The 14 digesters in Vermont are tracked and counted, and the storage of that manure doesn't have an emission because it's all captured and burned. The opportunity here is, of course, the ability to take that biogas and turn it into a useful product, whether it's electricity, using that methane to biogas to run a digester, whether it's flaring the methane and using it as a thermal application to heat the farm, to heat the milk house, to heat neighbors, or to take it, refine it, and turn it into renewable natural gas. And so there is a project in Vermont down in Salisbury that is providing Middlebury College with natural gas that has come from a dairy farm where the gases from the manure and other food waste has been off gas collected and refined and put into the pipeline as natural gas. So you can get energy from the manure, which is a valuable thing. It's very expensive to implement, expensive to operate. And so we're looking at what are the best opportunities for our medium and small scale farms in Vermont, because at this time, no off-the-shelf technology for Vermont-sized farms really exists in the way the almost exclusively large farms are using digesters in the state.
Yeah. So we only have 14?
Based on my last check of the AgStar database, yes, 14. Okay, what's the point of all this, right? Emission inventory, we're looking at manure storage and collection. Because we know that not all farming has an equal environmental benefit, right? On the left-hand side, we have what can be conceptualized as full width tillage, no conservation practices applied on a very steep slope, right? So lots of erosion, a lot of deposition, a lot of burning off of carbon in the soils in the form of organic matter. On the right-hand side, we have more of the type of farming system that relies on soil health practices and what Vermont farmers are moving towards. And what we see here is when you apply these managements, not only do we have a phosphorus reduction efficiency that is accepted and applied by DEC for farms that implement an acre of cover crop, an acre of reduced or no-till, another acre of riparian buffers or crop rotation, right? We can count that phosphorus efficiency. We don't yet have a state efficiency for what happens in the crop.
The picture on the left almost looks like it was hand painted or something. Doesn't look like a real picture. Do you know where that was taken from?
I think it's Indiana. I don't know, it's from some NRCS. I normally put the sources. I apologize. I've lost that in the years of using that image. But it's just a low quality photo, I think.
Certainly doesn't look like a Vermont photo.
No, I purposely chose a non-Vermont farm
Oh,
for the left-hand side.
Right?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do we really have farms that don't have a nutrient management plan?
Yeah, any.
There is a requirement for nutrient management for all farms in the state.
Thank you.
CSFOs and up need to have a written nutrient management plan. SFOs need to take soil tests and apply based on agronomic recommendations. If based on inspection they don't have that, there's an enforcement mechanism to compel them to.
And what's the fourth management practice? It's kind of blacked out
Oh,
there.
sorry, that's a crop rotation.
Okay, thanks.
And
I wouldn't use Indiana pictures because if you went to a public meeting and you showed this, I mean, I'd even be upset that a farmer in Vermont would let their fields look like that. And, you know, I visit farms quite often and I haven't seen anything like that in 20.
Well, the loss of soil is so.
5 years, but anyways,
Yeah, maybe a black and white photo from 50 years ago
Okay.
that's in Vermont would be helpful, but to show like over time it's changed. But yeah, I think that the credibility there just doesn't do it for me either.
just trying to, so the point of this is not Vermont farmers, are universally, I think this is a target on the right. The point is, and it's meant to be stark, right? It's not the same, right? It's not one for one. Managing a cow this way does not have these outputs. Growing an acre of corn on the left is not the same environmental impact as growing an acre of corn on the right. And so the other component of this, I don't know, representation is that there are also emission reduction coefficients, ERCs, that can be associated with these particular managements. And the state is not yet there yet for accepting or publishing what an emission reduction coefficient is. So this big chart is just intended to show that from the same unit of land, when you apply a conservation practice, for example, cover crop, right? There's not only an increase in soil carbon, right? Total CO2 across all of the categories, 0.16 CO2 equivalents an acre a year. However, there's also nitrous oxide emissions from the soil surface, depending on the management. So this actually shows an increase in emissions of direct nitrous oxide from the application of a cover crop, but the total net emission reduction coefficient is 0.15 with a range of a net emission to a net sequestration. And that's the whole point of this. You can dig into all the specifics, but managing land is not created equal. Applying a conservation practice can have a net sequestration, and depending on it, it can have a net emission. It's not always the right application depending on the pre-existing conditions. But the point is, it's not zero. It's not one-to-one. Management can affect outcomes.
That, I believe it. I mean, we set up these practices to help farmers do the practices for this sole purpose. And are there certain crops that make a bigger difference? Because we could pay more if you plant A than if you plant B. And farmers are very good about adapting to different suggestions, but somebody's got to help them understand that. And is that you or?
So with the direction of the legislature, 6 VSA Chapter 215 gives the Agency of Ag authority to run conservation programs, right? We partner with NRCS to pay for conservation implementation, farm agronomic practices program, right? Cover crop, crop rotation, water buffers, increased grazing management. Those are all predicated on water quality, but there is a climate benefit. And so articulating and tracking that climate benefit is, I think, the point of this whole 2 hours of trying to share this all with you. Is like, we can do both with the programs that exist. And you made an investment in those programs with the 4.76 million in additional ARPA dollars that are going towards this over the next 4 years. And so that's a big infusion to support farmers to do more. And it pairs well with the Payment for Ecosystem Services group that spent 3 years recommending that program, which is going to further do an assessment looking and kind of match us up with this slide, not just at the cropland, but looking at the land adjacent to the cropland. So the buffers, the unmanaged land, they can enroll forest land. But the other point of this is, the ag portion of the land use sector, farmers aren't just crop farmers in Vermont. They may do maple sugaring, they may have a woodlot. And so accounting for that is another thing to consider, right? If you have an acre, this is from the 2017 Ag Census. As soon as I have the 2022 Ag Census, I will be updating this to see what's changed over the past 5 years. But 47% of the land farmers manage is woodland. 47% of the land farmers manage is harvested cropland and permanent pasture. And so that's where my talking point, one-to-one. If you support farmers to have an acre of cropland, they're also stewarding an acre of forest land over here. And so the compounding benefit of keeping land in agriculture, you're going to get the additional carbon benefit from the trees on the property.
When you go to East Coast conventions or national conventions, and you talk, hear talks about the same issue, how do we compare like with other states in the country?
Yes, so U.S. Climate Alliance is a great place to learn from how other states are approaching climate change,
Yeah.
Maine, for example, has two inventories that they've instituted. One is the gross emission inventory that like Vermont does, and the other is a net emissions inventory. We think we're doing well with 73% forested. They're up in the 80s of forest cover that they have. And so their gross, to account for that, they pass a lot of also count the net emissions within the state. This is a big question, right? There's been a lot of, you look at the agriculture globally is 11% of emissions, right? It's not the largest driver of climate change, and it provides important food security and other outputs from the land base. So a lot of focus and research has been on, in my understanding, fossil fuel-based sectors and how to have a transition to carbon-free economy, or it's still maintaining an economy while transitioning out of the use of fossil fuels. And so the maturity of the state inventory, the national inventory assessments for this question of ag forestry of the land use, how does the state deal with agriculture is a question that I feel is not answered on the national stage. And so this is not, I feel, a reflection on Vermont or anything Vermont's been doing. It's just bringing up, hey, as you set this emission reduction target, maybe there's this piece that's missed there about the whole sequestration potential that agriculture is separated from. And Vermont's not the only state to be wrestling with this. So we're not alone in looking at this question. And at this time, there's no real solution. There's no final solution.
Tell us if we're doing as good as Maine or New Hampshire and New York, or if we're really down in the lower group of, trying to get this done, and because we seem to spend an awful lot of money and time, we have in this committee to try to help all these things. And are we doing as well as our neighbors, you might say?
I like to point to graphs and charts and other people's data to be like, look at how we're doing. All I have for that is, I don't know if there's really been a comparison of the progress states have made towards these goals, but anecdotally speaking with colleagues in other departments of agriculture and other ANRs, the system that Vermont has set up to deliver service to farms based largely on water, right? It's not just, we have a regulatory backstop, we have RAPs, but then there's also education, outreach, technical financial assistance, and a lot of investment, a permanent funding source. A lot of states are jealous of Vermont and the system that we have set up. The permanent funding system for water is incredibly important for keeping this progress happening for agriculture. Last week, you'll remember I shared the 95% of phosphorus reduction coming from agriculture. Maintaining that funding is needed for agriculture's need to meet the TMDL, but we also get all these climate co-benefits. And when I say statutory 6 VSA chapter 215, there are components of that where the state agency of ag is directed to work with NRCS, right? There's a lot of states where those agencies don't really get along for some reason. I don't know how, but I think that's some of the strength in Vermont is small state, a lot of people working together, and a permanent funding source that is very effective at this time. So I think Vermont's doing pretty well on that space.
So again, in a broad sense, they're all overall areas where we can reduce and all. Sitting here as I put money towards this, and we talk about putting money, I really don't get a feel about where are the areas that we're spending money that we're getting the biggest bang for the buck for, and how would I sort that out? I understand where the dairy cows are here, and I understand that within that whole realm, there's the whole levels, and then on the soils, there's the whole realm. But there's a number of different things you can do. If we did no-till seeders versus other things, what do we get, and how do I know that I'm putting my money where I can get the biggest bang for the buck in doing this? How can I, as a policy person, sort through this?
I think that's a great question, and I am going to attempt to share.
Looking for your answer.
Well, good, because
Ryan.
there's so much here that, it's like, oh.
Well, I mean, I don't know how many millions we've spent.
Well, I get that, and I'm just trying to say, how do I measure that I've done the best?
But no, you're no till cedar. 200,000, you're gonna have to seed by hand, one seed at a time.
Yeah, geez, no, but I mean, when I look at the soils, I got the picture the other day from North Dakota when they're showing
Yeah.
that it was pretty sad if you don't. It's pretty clear that helps a lot.
Yeah.
But versus other things, where's my biggest bang?
Sure. So this is from the Nature Conservancy Canada. And they, did a study of just the natural working land. So I can't compare this to, there's a whole, IPCC has a chart which can talk about the relative cost effectiveness of different strategies, and agriculture comes out pretty well in that matrix, and I can share that with you as a orientation point. I don't have that with me either off the top of my head or in a presentation. What I do have is a comparison of the natural and working lands mitigation opportunities in Canada, right? So this is TNC Canada doing a nationwide analysis of the opportunity that exists by 2030. And they were surprised to find that agriculture and cropland management was the largest single opportunity between protecting the existing land base, management changes, and restoration. The largest potential sources for mitigation were agriculture, and they were available for relatively cheap, right? 19.6 metric tons or million metric tons in Canada, available below $50 a ton. And so when you think about.
So what I get from
Yeah.
you just said is it's cropland management that is for them nearly a third of everything. And how can I translate? So is that where I should spend a lot of my, or we're spending a lot of our money? And so in relationship to that, I'm just trying to.
Yeah, so I shared in our last discussion the point of, or the state of soil health, right? The opportunity for ag soils to provide a big sink. And the point I'm bringing up is in the emissions inventory with the targets, it started me up where I left off.
And can I ask, sorry to take up so much time, but in that, and what the Canadians did in that study, is that what it's produced to get from here to the end of it? Or does it take out that a field of corn apparently, or a field of crops does eat up so much carbon itself in its growing? So is that a net number?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, and I think that's the whole point of this is the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee looked through natural climate solutions, looked through agriculture management. They're cost effective, farmers are already implementing them. They are very effective. They provide an immediate and medium-term benefit under the emissions reduction framework that the GWSA is promulgated on. We can't count those towards agriculture's emission because it's just the cows burping, the storage of the manure, and the spreading of manure that makes up, and a little bit of fertilizer use that makes up that 16%. And so this is to a structural challenge that we're working with ANR on, which is to review the agricultural sector greenhouse gas emissions and sequestration in Vermont, how to set up a framework which is inclusive of how to meet net zero targets, but also trying to wrestle with this seemingly intractable issue, which is emissions on a gross basis for agriculture. Just look at cows and manure and aren't inclusive of those cost-effective reductions. And so the recommendations from the Agriculture Ecosystem Subcommittee was, I didn't share my screen, so I apologize. It's focused on continuing to support those practices which are delivering water quality success, continuing to build on that. There's already a functioning system. Literature shows they're cost effective and effective, and eventually we'll figure out a way to count and track those for climate. But that's the I guess point of this next hour of the presentation is there's a lot of power in ag soils. It's not fully able to be counted in the emissions inventory at this time. And so that's just one of the big gaps that the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee wrestled with, recommended research. We've state through ANR received funding from the U.S. Climate Alliance to engage in a contractor and do this research. And so there's no recommendation yet, and that's going to be forthcoming. But I just wanted to make you all aware of some of the structural issues I think within the conflict of the law for agriculture, and that we can't count those benefits towards that. Like, it's not like farmers do more cover crop and then at 16% goes down. It's not, can't count that.
And
At this time.
when is that gonna be completed? So we have those numbers available.
The RFP was out, it's closed, it's being reviewed. I'm hopeful that the work will start this spring, and I believe the timeline is a recommendation in 2023. So a recommendation before next legislative session.
But what bothers me about the whole issue is we don't have the data to be able to load onto the vehicle that's moving through here this year, not next year, but this year. So how are we, as a representative of the people back up in the Northeast Kingdom, how do I go home and sell them on the idea that we're doing what's right, but yet we haven't got the studies all done to get there? And they're gonna tell me, you better back school by. I mean, I don't know how you move forward with a plan without all the data that you need to put a good plan together with.
You and I are saying the same things, only from different places. I'm trying to say, where's the biggest bang for the buck? And you're saying, I haven't got the studies done to tell you.
Well, they think they know that there's a lot missing from the soils that we're producing, but we aren't sure. It might turn out to be a negative.
Yeah, so to, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And, we know something is directionally beneficial. We just don't.
Would you like calling these people?
If you have a note for them, yeah, you can give it to me. I can send it to them.
I'd rather have you call on the phone.
Oh,
Are you into that? Yeah.
I don't know. I just bring this.
I'm
Sorry.
kidding. Have a good day.
So we know there's a lot of opportunity here. We know there's positive sequestration. If you run another module with an SIT, we know that there is positive sequestration on an annual basis from all of the agricultural lands. And implementing those practices are needed for water quality, right? And so the message to farmers is keep doing the water quality practices. There's benefits for climate. We know they're positive benefits. We can use this tool, the COMET tool, to track the benefit. What's the right tool for Vermont, though, is the research question. Like, how specific can we get? Because we have very good data, right? We're tracking on an acre by acre basis all of the implementation that's happening on farms. DEC can use that geospatial data to apply a phosphorus reduction coefficient, and that's what gives us all of those ag reductions. Working on building that for climate is where we are. So I'm hoping that the message isn't, ambiguity. It's keep using these good practices. This we'll be able to count them hopefully in the near future. So it's not to say hey, stop and throw it all away. It's like, no, keep doing the water practices. We know we get these benefits, and this will be reconciled hopefully in the
Well, we've
next
been
little bit.
at this since '06 or some 8 or something. I mean, 15, 18 years. And why with the reports that we've been getting in the ag rooms from you folks and farmers, and they like what we're doing. They're doing what we asked them or suggest to do. The agencies are all working together. So why would you tip the cart on its side and do some other stuff if everything is moving in the right direction? The only thing we could do is speed it up a little bit and make it go faster, but so would you say we're doing pretty good?
I would. The main recommendation from the Agri Ecosystem Subcommittee is, I'll paraphrase, keep using the existing state programs.
Yeah.
They're working, they're functioning, farmers are participating, and we'll count the benefit in the near future, but we know it's real and tangible. It's just finding the right model and the right assumptions to make sure that we're assessing all of those practices on an equal basis. So
Yeah, and we know that the development of smaller digesters, to use up even get more of this gas out of the manure it's coming, but it isn't here yet. It hasn't been developed fully.
yes, that is an area, identifying the gaps, right? The feed management research and programs. A lot of people see opportunity there. Funding that research is important. Finding small scale digesters and technologies and an implementation structure that works. It's important because farmers are busy farming, and to drop a digester that you have to manage and a new motor to generate electricity, it's a lot to ask of a small farm that may not have additional staff. And so how do you find a technology that is beneficial and adds to either the revenue stream or viability of a farm, while also getting that emission reduction benefit from the destruction of that methane and manure pit? There is no silver bullet at this point in time for the medium and small scale farm, but we are working with partners and others in state government to try to come up with a framework and some technologies that will be appropriate for Vermont farms.
So there isn't anything from your professional point of view that you would recommend to us to do, like during this biennium, to help with your process, other than keep doing what we're doing and try to keep that funded?
Yes, Senator. I think that is a fair summary. Is processes are working. I think they're working well, and no specific policy recommendations at this time on the climate front, outside of that minor housekeeping provision in the SEEP program, which kind of speaks to the term emissions reduction compared to mitigation, right? And trying to use that mitigation term from the Global Warming Solutions Act to be more inclusive of the sequestration as well as the emission reduction. And so that would be the only, I think, tangible piece of policy the agency has proposed at this point is in that housekeeping bill.
Yeah. Any other questions? Right.
Not a question, just a comment, I guess, Mr. Chair. I'd rather see money spent helping the small farmer buy a digester than do another study about how we're doing. It just, to me, it gets a little bit I don't know what the right term is. We seem to study and study and study, and yet, from what you're saying, and I think your agency does a great job. I think you do a super job. All the things we've talked about, land management, feed management, all those things are working. I don't know what else we need to study, just to count something as, it mystifies me why we can't just say to the farmer, here's something we know will work, we're gonna pay for it.
I think we're there. Do the cover crop, do the no-till, do the grazing. We know those work. We know there's a benefit. Setting up, you remember there was a bit of a lag time in the phosphorus world for, we know that these practices are beneficial. The exact degree based on soil type, that's what's so challenging. We get down to a process-based model that isn't just acres of corn and numbers of cows. It becomes very interactive and very complicated based on soil type, slope, management. How can you get down to that level of detail? It is really where the nuts and bolts of the work is. Like directionally, we know these are good and have a positive sequestration benefit. Exactly how much, we know what the parameters are, but making that fit Vermont's landscape is where that research stands. So, at this, generally around $10 million between, in the Clean Water Fund for agriculture, and about, this is a $75,000 grant from the U.S. Climate Alliance. So it's not, it doesn't take a lot of resources to get there because a lot of work is done outside of Vermont. It's just pulling together the right combinations of models and the existing statewide data that we have to really mesh it together in a reporting framework that's going to do justice to the opportunity that's there.
So next year you'll have that report that you can come back to us with.
It is, I got to check in with James Zorchek on the timeline of that RFP. My memory is we're going to have a final report in 2023 with some recommendations for next steps out of that Climate Alliance grant. So my gut feeling is yes, by the next time this biennium, the next 24, right? Is it? It's 23 right now.
Yeah.
Thank you. That will hopefully we'll have some recommendations.
You
for
aren't
that.
doing all the figuring on this stuff. I don't know what
I know what year it is.
what year.
Oh goodness.
I don't blame you for losing track. We've been at this so long. But anyways, if there are no other questions,
You're doing a good job.
thanks a lot, Ryan.
Thank you. Appreciate your attention.
It's good for us to hear that what we have done in the past to move this stuff forward is working to the best it can from your knowledge, and you're the ag expert on this, and so it's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
So I got a little job for you, a message to deliver elsewhere in the building.
I'm sorry I had to get up twice. There's on a page today. It's a part-time gig.
He just asked the page to return some phone calls.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd be better at that.
Yeah.
On her first day, right? Didn't they just start today?
They did.
She didn't know what to do.
Poor thing. She'll never be back.
That
Odor was Tom Chittenden's daughter.
was
It might have been. Yeah.
very pleasant.
Yeah, very,
young
yeah,
girl.
yeah.
She's very.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That last group of pages we had was good.
They were fun.
They sure
Yeah,
were.
they were.
They did well.
Good. Well, Michael, good morning.
Morning.
So can we chat a little bit about our right to farm stuff? Is that what we're on? I think we're gonna write up some new stuff.
Yep.
And the only question that I've had sent to me in regards to our suggested changes was word regional. yeah. So you must have figured out a different word that we can use there.
Not sure about that, but I'd like to talk about that. It's on page 5.
Yeah. So, so Michael did some work on our right to farm. Did you work in that mediation type deal?
I did.
Oh, okay. So, you wanna run, do you have copies or?
I think you all have copies in front of you from what I can see.
Under the agenda.
Yep.
All right.
I can put it on the screen in a minute, but it's always right when I'm about to testify that an app has to update itself.
Do you want me to do that?
Pardon? If you want to, it's taking longer to update for some
Here
reason.
it is.
Okay, so you heard this is Mike O'Grady with Legislative Council. You heard testimony over the past couple of weeks about how the current standard or the standard in the bill that you were looking at that would prevent a person from bringing a nuisance action was in part based on whether or not they were complying with agricultural water quality requirements. And you heard from a couple of different interested parties that might not be the best standard, and that it doesn't cover every type of activity that might generate a nuisance. And then you heard from the agency about pesticide and pesticide drift, and about how if they're complying with the pesticide rules, that there shouldn't be pesticide drift, and that they're if they're complying with it, then they're basically shouldn't be creating a nuisance or a trespass. But then that doesn't all, if you include ag water quality requirements and then compliance with the pesticide rules, that still doesn't get to all of the activities that potentially could cause a nuisance, say odor, flies, dust, etc. So the chair asked me to look at how some of the other states do that. And what the other states do is that they say that there's no nuisance action that can be brought. You have the time period, it's usually 1 to 3 years that they've been there prior to the surrounding activity. And then the farm has to be complying with good agricultural practices. And generally, those states that use that standard, which include Connecticut, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Tennessee, and a few others, they define the generally accepted agricultural practices, and you'll see this on page 4. So what I've done is I've added a definition to the right to farm law, and it would define generally accepted agricultural practices as complying with your agricultural water quality requirements in 6 VSA Chapter 215, including any permit requirements or the requirements of the RAPs, complying with the Agency of Agriculture's Food and Markets rule for control of pesticides. And then this last subdivision C is how many states define what a good agricultural practice is. It's practices conducted in a manner consistent with proper and accepted customs and standards as established and followed by similar operations of agricultural activities in a similar municipality or region of the state and under similar circumstances. Now, there's some variations on that, and you could probably get some simpler language, but it's basically that you are conducting your agricultural practice in the way that others in that municipality or region or state would be conducting those agricultural practices as well. The issue with this type of language is it becomes a fact-based issue. It becomes something that a court has to figure out. And so the court would have to look at and take testimony on what the custom and proper accepted practices are in that municipality and region, but it sets a baseline of what is acceptable and normal for purposes of a nuisance or trespass action.
So what do you folks think about setting something like this up, or at least, I guess if you haven't got suggestions on how to fix this, what we should do is, I think we have this back on the agenda for Friday, I think. And we hopefully could get some witnesses in. Emma, are you gonna have any witnesses available on Friday?
I am, I'm gonna have a list for Linda by the end of the day today.
So we could hear from, the witnesses that maybe that we'd heard from before, or even new people, to give us some direction on language.
So there is an additional component. And the chair stopped by my office one day and talked to me about testimony that you received. I think it was from Mr. Sanderson, I think his name was, at COF, about how he identified an issue with the bill is that it's taking away redress or an opportunity for a remedy from neighboring property owners. And that was an issue that arose in the Sport Shooting Range Protection Act, 2005, 2006, where there was a similar nuisance protection for the sports shooting ranges. If they had been in operation for a certain amount of time, they were complying with range practices, etc., complying with municipal ordinances, that they would be protected from nuisance protection. So what the General Assembly did then is said, you're not necessarily prohibited from bringing a nuisance action neighboring property owner, but before you do, you have to at least attempt to go to mediation once with the sports shooting range. And that is not unique to the Sports Shooting Range Protection Act in Vermont. It is a process that's used in at least 3 states under the right to farm law, in at least 3 states.
Yeah, on page 6.
So we didn't figure that out on our own.
No, it was something that was brought to the Senate Judiciary Committee when they were doing the Sports Shooting Range Protection Act, and said, hey, look, I think at that time they focused on Iowa. It said Iowa has this mandated, you have to go to mediation before the nuisance suit can be brought. Iowa has it, Maryland has it. Louisiana has a different. Louisiana encourages people to go to mediation, but if they file without going to mediation, the court can require mediation before the court takes up the nuisance.
Vermont already passed that with the shooting range.
It's already in law for sports shooting ranges.
Down in judiciary, if we get the bill out of here and goes there. So we're using their language.
It's very similar to the sports shooting range protection.
Right?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Michael, if it does go to mediation, would the court, well, let me back up. If it goes to mediation and is not resolved, and it then eventuates into a court hearing, would the testimony taken in the mediation help to determine the facts in the court?
Basically, I will need to check on this with the judiciary team, but in certain mediations, you are allowed to use record testimony that's produced. And so it's possible.
Okay.
And this is a mediation going to court, not mediation going to, do you appeal to ag?
No, well, that's actually a great question, because that's how Maryland does it. Maryland has a mediation board built into their Agency of Agriculture.
Right.
And so
That was my.
And so you apply for mediation to that board before you can bring a nuisance claim in Maryland.
And this envisions going a mediation in court?
This is it's, you can use a licensed mediator to do this. It doesn't actually
Yeah.
have to go to court, but the results would then be recognized, if agreed to, would be recognized by a court as binding.
See,
So, sorry, go ahead.
if Scott, was it?
Mhm.
I mean, if he would go along with the way we've got this, Michael's crafted it, I think an individual homeowner that has a problem with the farmer, I would think that they would feel like it would be fair if you went to a neutral mediation group or person. But if you had it over in the Department of Ag, they might feel that you're giving the farmer a leg up and not feel it's very free, you know, or even.
Right.
And to appease the opposition to this, if they go along with what we've got, I would presume and feel better leaving it like we got it than setting up a separate group in the ag agency to act as the mediator. Right?
How would it work if one party just didn't want to mediate? How does that all get figured out, and who pays for it, and how the mediator is chosen?
Well, the language here provides that if there's going to be mediations, the parties shall share the cost.
Okay.
And if a party doesn't want to go to mediation, there's options. Right now, the language basically says that they can agree to go to binding arbitration. And you still can, you have to basically, the language requires you to attempt to resolve the suit through mediation. It doesn't require it to be resolved. So you would just need to show
I
that
see.
you
Good
attempted
faith.
it, and that the other party would not go to mediation, et cetera, and then you would be able to bring that thing.
I just, so I'm gonna apply to a third-party mediator. Where do I apply?
No, you don't apply. You basically, the two parties agree to hire a mediator and to conduct mediation. Mediation results in an agreement. And then that agreement is formalized, can be formalized by a court.
Okay, well,
There's people that do this
No.
professionally around the state.
Yeah.
A lot of teacher contracts, some of them will get to a mediator. Court cases sometimes get to a mediator, I believe. What other things?
if you go to the Human Rights Commission, you appeal to the Human Rights Commission, then a third-party mediator is hired to
Right.
sort out between them. But it's done under the umbrella. There's just a number of ways to do this.
There are.
I'm just trying to understand. And
I mean,
I think it's great to go to a mediator.
think of it like divorce, right? When you're doing a voluntary divorce.
You go to court.
You have to follow the process in court for divorce, but you can also, through a voluntary agreement between the two parties, and that can include a mediation where you hire a mediator to resolve things like compensation for a house or child custody, et cetera.
Or the court can,
Or the court can order that. That's true. And remember, this is a prerequisite before you go to file with the court for nuisance action. So the intent is that it's resolved
okay,
between the parties before it gets to the court, but it still can go to the court.
fine. Sorry for that.
No, that's okay.
Good question.
No, now when you go get a divorce.
How to do it.
After 27
Just
years.
get your wallet out and.
After 27 years of not being married, Bobby. You know, it's.
Well, are we headed in any direction, Irene?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With the current backup in the court systems, does that just mean that the blessing for mediation waits a few years, or can that be done quickly? You know, a mediator comes to a conclusion, submits to the court, can they rubber stamp it soon after? Or does that just mean the odor or the problem is going to go on for 5 years while they wait for court?
Sure. This is something I'd probably want to check with the administrative judge about. But I think likely what the courts would do is they would use an assistant judge to approve this because it is an agreement between the parties. So I think that is what the courts would do, but I would check with the administrative judge first.
But if the side judge or those could deal with something like this, it'd be a lot quicker, cheaper, you'd get it resolved sooner.
Yeah.
Because most of these issues, the faster you can get it resolved, the better the neighbors will get along afterwards, and we're getting down to the point where, we're getting fewer and fewer farms all the time and more neighbors all the time. And the quicker you could get something like this resolved, it would be better for everybody involved.
Just when the CLF guy came in and said, well, most people go and talk, when it's conflict with the neighbors, people avoid conflict. So I think a mediator idea like this is a great idea to help bring people together.
Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question, Michael, on page 4, subsection C. I'm reading it and I'm thinking to myself, are there really that different customs and standards throughout the state? Or I'm trying to understand why it seems to indicate that there probably are different accepted agricultural practices from county to county, from geographic limitation, all that kind of stuff.
I think that's a decision that you could make, that you could limit it to similar practices within Vermont. I don't think there's that much variation between municipality and region in the state anymore, especially with farming practices becoming so efficient and based a lot on the technology that's being used. I do think you could probably say it was within the state instead of municipality or region. But I was using another state as a standard, actually 4 other states that have that similar region or municipality language. I wanted to bring you something that you could say, hey, this is how they do it.
Yeah.
Elsewhere.
I'm just wondering, I mean, if I live in Rutland County, so are the practices in Rutland substantially different than they are in Essex or Orleans?
I think Addison might be different because they got all that heavy clay. So they may have some different practices working that wet, heavy clay land than you might over on the Connecticut River, but we're still small enough.
Right.
So that should be pretty much the same, Brian.
So where did the required agricultural practices come into this? I know.
They are
Where's that?
part
Subsection A.
of the definition. So in order to, you'll see on page 5, in order to provide that no nuisance suit can be brought, it still has been in operation for more than 1 year, and the activity was not a nuisance or trespass at the time the activity was initiated.
Then we add the we added something as
The
a
pesticide. Yeah,
pesticide.
page 4.
That's page 4, line 8 and
We
9.
added that so that that's clear that if they aren't following those rules and regs, they're in trouble.
And then the activity has to be conducted in accordance with generally accepted agricultural practices. It means it has to comply with the RAPs and its other ag water quality, relevant ag water quality permits, has to comply with the pesticide rules, and then it has to be in conformity with the practices conducted by similar operators of ag activities in whatever geographic region you want to define.
So then why are we, and this, I'm just probably being obtuse here, why are we saying generally accepted agricultural practices in some spots and not RAPs in others? Why don't we just do consistently, everybody, help me kind of,
Well, the RAPs are they are water quality focused.
right?
And as you heard from Laura DePietro and Steve Collier, they don't specifically address all forms of activity that can raise nuisance claims.
Got it.
So pesticide application, for example,
Right.
drift, that's not covered by the RAPs. Odor would not be covered by the RAPs. It would be covered by the large farm permits, but not the RAPs.
Thank you.
Dust, et cetera, not covered by the
Yeah.
RAP. So that's where you get that third category of the generally practices that are consistent with similar.
Is there something in statute that defines generally accepted agricultural practices, or is that like a
This is what it would be.
lawyer's dream?
I did reference that. I do think it will
Yeah.
be something where people would have to prove through evidence, witnesses, probably bringing somebody from extension or the agency to say that the practice that's being brought is, practice being addressed is something that's a generally accepted practice.
Thank you.
See that, Irene?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Does 2C in any way hinder innovation on a farm? Like someone's afraid to try something because nobody else is doing it, and yet
Interesting.
it could reduce a lot of greenhouse gases or something, but oh no, wait a minute, my neighbor might not like the sound, smell, sight of it, and so they get nailed by that.
So on page 4, line 4, you'll see there's a definition of agricultural activities that is part of the activities that are protected by the right to farm. Fortunately, you don't see the full definition here, but when you go to 6 VSA 4802, you will see that it includes the ability to modify your farm, to innovate, et cetera. So that innovative activity is already protected.
Okay, thank you.
I like it.
Yeah. Are there other changes that anyone would like to ask Michael to consider or think about changing at this point? What we'll do is if there are, I mean, you don't have to think about it right this minute, but I'd like to, if there are going to be some more changes, to get this as good as we get it as a committee, to have it for Friday for the participants in that hearing to be able to look at and talk about and but we may ask them Friday during the hearing, you know, if because they're gonna have some comments, I'm sure, on, because they live it. You know, Richie's the closest thing we've got to a farmer in here, and
That isn't much.
and that isn't much. So Brian, what do you think? You got more?
Yeah, I'll look, I'm happy to look it over, Mr. Chair. I guess the one thing is that just the generally accepted agricultural practices, it seems like a definition would be needed there, or some greater understanding. I don't know, are there other statutes that we use that in other policy that say generally? Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's just the terminology that's being used. You get to find it.
Actually using the
the term, you could get rid of generally, you could just say, you know, custom agricultural practices or.
Or come up with a definition.
Well, there is a
There
It
definition.
is on page
Oh, there
4.
is.
On
I'm
page
sorry, I
4.
missed that part.
Right, and I understand generally acceptable.
Yeah.
I under that,
Pretty broad.
Yeah.
but that's really just, you could call it
Could call
law,
it, right,
you know?
right,
and you know, and it's really just the term is.
yes, thanks.
So there was a word reasonable that was in play that I got an email about, I thought, but that has been changed, I guess, to generally accepted. I'm just trying to remember. I don't even remember.
Emma, do you recall where that was?
On the new draft, I believe it's on page 3, line 5,
Reasonable,
but I'm not sure if that new definition
reasonably.
fixed
Well,
that.
that's in statute now, I guess.
Page 3, line 5.
Yeah,
Yeah.
first word.
The first word is reasonable.
First word on mine is agricultural activity.
Huh, okay.
Oh, move up. a-
Isn't that funny?
Very Richard.
Oh.
Okay, oh, sure, got it. Well, honestly,
There it is.
if you're gonna use the generally accepted agricultural practices, those are reasonable agricultural activities. Because that's the standard in the state.
Okay.
I mean, but that purpose section, that hasn't changed. I mean, that's been
Right.
there since
Oh,
2003, maybe even before
oh,
that.
that's existing language.
Yes.
Yeah. Um,
Would it make sense to change that to generally accepted?
I think that's a possibility. You might want to use some of you might want to say instead of reasonable agricultural activities.
You can just remove it. That way you're not making a value judgment yet, right? It's just a summary.
That's definitely a possibility as well. You could say something like the customs and standards of agricultural activities followed in the state instead of reasonable agricultural activities. I think you have options there. But again, that language has been
It's
there
been
since
there.
2003, at least.
Yeah, and that, I don't think anybody asked us to remove that. They highlighted that as maybe we ought to look at and
Right.
figure out if it should be there or not. And,
And it's also a purpose section.
yeah,
Most purpose sections are not binding, they're just instructive to a court.
any other suggested changes?
Looks good.
Well, I guess if you want to fool with that language on page
Right. To get them,
over further,
eliminate the municipalities and the
I
regions.
think so.
Yeah.
yeah, and make it more solid.
Statewide.
Yeah, that would be fine. When, are you gonna be able to be with us on Friday? or-
I have to participate remotely, just FYI for the committee, my son's having surgery on his ears tomorrow. and
Oh.
so, I don't know how significant it's gonna be, so,
Year?
yeah, it's not cancer, but it's a growth on both of his ears, and they don't know why it's there, but there's something that they identified inside that they have to cut out.
Yeah, well.
We hope
Well, that's the
Yeah.
place you need to be.
Exactly.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
mean, if you're free on Friday to be on Zoom, that's
But
fine.
I think I'll be fine. They don't think the procedure is gonna be that significant, but I just wanna.
Oh, that's where you should be.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
First things first.
Both ears, you said?
Yeah, that's why
Yeah.
They can't understand, like, they thought it was an ingrown hair, but then like, why would you have?
That's.
Yeah,
But it doesn't affect his hearing loss.
No, it can ultimately if they don't get rid of it.
Okay.
yeah. How old a boy is he?
15.
Yeah,
Well, he's gonna be 15 in 3 weeks.
pretty soon.
He's gonna be 50.
Well, that'd be good to get that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah, good luck.
They, if there are no other questions, is there anything else, Michael, that we need,
No, I think am I in this week on the miscellaneous bill?
Thursday on the
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah.
see, for the committee, before town meeting, I'd like to get that bill out of here, and if we can, get this one done so everyone feels comfortable with it, this one, before town meeting,
That'd be great.
and then the House would have plenty of time in the second half to do whatever they've got to do, and they'll send us some of their stuff, so.
Okay.
Would we move the right to farm bill to judiciary on the floor, or?
Well, yeah, hopefully, and then Sears can look at it, hopefully he'll need it.
Okay.
I'd like to get it in a position where he's comfortable
Oh, absolutely.
as possible with it.
I think you've made great changes.
Yeah.
Senator Starr, do you know when, so crossover, is it the 17th?
We don't have one, I don't. No, we
Good. No crossover date. Oh, I thought we did have the 17th, but
Maybe,
I thought it was,
yeah.
because I remember hearing it was
Yeah,
really late.
It's in the calendar. It is a little late this
I
year.
don't ever
Yes.
worry about it.
Yeah.
Don't even think about
All
it.
right.
Senator Campion, Senator Starr.
It's probably a compliment for both of us.
I bet it is. I'm the other lucky. I'm not, what did I win? Is this an apple? Yes, sir.
Have nothing to.
Well,
Yeah.
at least it's from my district.
Right.
It's after the town meeting break, I think,
It is, it's like,
Yeah.
yeah.
but it's in the calendar.
It's in the
Late. I just
calendar.
remember thinking, wow,
Yeah,
Let me look it up.
that's.
but it'd be good to get those two going, either the Sears or.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
the housekeeping bill, have you gone through that, Michael?
With you?
Yeah,
Yep.
we've been through it.
Mhm.
We need to work on that, make sure that it's where we want it to be before we vote it, but we got a couple more weeks anyway, so. We'll go through that a little closer and make sure we feel comfortable with what they're proposing.
It is March 17th.
Evacuation day.
Also,
Also St. Patrick's Day.
that's a week couple of weeks. We go on the 7th or something, right? That week of
It's
the
our week.
7th.
We're out,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be the week we come back would be crossover.
Yeah.
And it's not good to get caught up in.
No,
that
you don't
junk
wanna.
either. You
We'll get
wanna
this
get
done.
it done either before or do what I do it the week after or two after and go get it.
Yeah. So I'm supposed to speak at the Troy Town meeting, I think, on that Tuesday. They just want an update on things. Yeah, yeah.
Troy, they're coming?
Yeah.
The
Are you
featured
still the
speaker.
moderator?
I got an email about that. You're the featured
Are you-
speaker, right?
Yeah, right.
Are you
Imagine if I
shutting
should.
Him?
off? He's the moderator.
Are you the moderator?
Yes, so
You
he
just probably would not
Yeah,
get it.
yeah. We could have a stand up.
How long you been the moderator?
Oh,
up
my-
Since I was 21.
Really?
there?
That's great.
That's a long time ago, isn't it?
Well, a few years.
So,
Um,
Great,
and,
thank you.
yeah, anything else for
No.
Michael? No? Well,
good.
thank you. Mike.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Mike.
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll,
I haven't seen you in 5 years since before COVID.
Are we off?
yeah. Yeah, we're all, I think we're all done. Anything else from any?